Dear all, it gives me great pleasure to bring to you the very first episode of Usawa Talks. We are turning 7 this year in July, and Usawa Talks is something that had been dreamt of as Usawa was being born, as a conversation, in-depth conversation with writers, poets, sometimes even editors and publishers about the process, the creative process, the processes which come together so that a book can be produced. In this first episode, we are in conversation with a wonderful writer, poet, playwright, novelist, journalist, Annie Zaidi. Annie is in conversation with Anjali Chauhan, who is a feminist research scholar and a writer herself. Annie Zaidi has written prolifically across the years, across the decades, and she has written across genres, which is not an easy thing to do. And her works across genres have also won multiple awards and accolades. Now she is back with her latest novel, The Comeback. In 2020, her novel Prelude to a Riot won the Tata Literature Live Award for Book of the Year. In 2019, she won the Nine Dots Prize for her work Bread, Cement, Cactus. And in 2018, she won the Hindu Playwright Award for her play Untitled One. Annie has been published. She is a professional journalist. She started her work right after college, and she has worked and been published across all major publications in India and even outside. At Usawa, we have been very fortunate to have had the chance to publish her poems on Manipur.
Glad to meet you again, Annie. So I'll begin with a few lines to explain the context of the book. So Annie Zaidi's The Comeback is a stirring meditation on love, longing, and fragile nature of human relationships. Set in the fictional town of Baansa, the novel follows the emotional aftermath of a long-lost friendship between two men, Asghar and John, whose lives were once intertwined through theatre. So beginning with the theme itself, the comeback explores fractured nature of friendships and the weight of past choices. What drew you to these themes?
I think in this particular, in the case of this particular novel, one of my triggers for writing it was actually reading an interview by an actor, and he'd finally made it big enough at least to be interviewed, right, by a major newspaper, and he was sharing stories about his past, etc. And I was thinking about it, about the world that he had left behind, right? And this world is a world that still perhaps has room for him, but he no longer has room for that world in his life because of the choices he's making. He wants to do films, it's impossible to do films there. It may have been possible to do theater, but not in the cinema, right? That there's no room to make films. There's not enough money in the system. There's not enough talent in the system. And then I began to think about why it is like that, right? When we move away from smaller towns, move towards major centers, what happens to the centers? We bring talent into big cities, but that talent was not nurtured by the big cities. It was actually created and nurtured by the smaller centers. Those were some of the things that I was thinking about. And then I began to think of friendship. Partly because whatever little I've seen of the theater world, whether it's in India or elsewhere, solidarity and friendship is a big part of what makes it happen. You cannot make it happen without community. Film also, it is collaborative, but the nature of collaboration in film is slightly different from the nature of collaboration in theater. The stakes are so much lower, the financial stakes in theater, that you really have to be committed to the art itself, to the form, to your own talent, but you also have to be committed to the group. For a group to hold together through thick and thin, through rehearsals, through no money for many years, it's hard. But then those friendships are also really close and really like striking sometimes to see the way people show up for each other and are there for each other. But there's always a little part of, even in this community, the small part that wants to leave and do bigger and better things. So I was reflecting on that, about what happens to those people who've made you what you are, but then you kind of abandon them in a small way, and you don't think of it as abandonment, but it is.
Continuing on the same lines, your novel moves beyond the typical romantic arcs and instead examine deeper, longer, long-standing bonds. There was almost a romantic tension between Asghar and John if we read through closely. In this aspect, how do you conceptualize love and friendship in your storytelling?
Yeah, one review actually called it a bromance today. Um, I don't know. I don't think of it as a bromance really, but um, I do think, in fact, Paramita Vora once wrote a column about it, and that's when it struck me that there is romance in friendships. We don't call it romance because then that complicates things, and then we don't want any sexual tension in these friendships, etc., in platonic relationships. But the thing is that romance is more than just sexual relationships. There is romance in a worldview, um, and in a way of living, right? To buy someone flowers, for example, is romantic, but you don't only buy flowers for people you're chasing, in a sexual way. You also buy flowers for your mother, you buy flowers for your children. Or the first bouquet of flowers I ever got, actually, a girl gave me, one of my friends from college. I She just felt it's my birthday, so bought me flowers. Um, so I do think that, and I have had quite good and intense friendships. In some ways, I've been lucky. In some ways, also unlucky, because then you lose certain friendships. And the loss I felt quite keenly. And then I went up and read about it. And psychologists also say that losing a long-standing friendship, especially if it's a friendship which is like a sisterhood kind of friendship, or in this case, like in a novel, almost a brotherhood kind of friendship, a bromance, if you like. Uh, if somebody is like a bro, and you lose this guy, and he's your mentor, and he's the guy you count on for emotional support, and um, I don't know. I mean, that would hurt, right? It would hurt even more than a divorce, possibly, because that relationship has lasted longer.
It's very interesting. Nostalgia plays a very crucial role in the comeback, especially John, who can be seen continuously living in the past and introspecting his choices and somehow do not still making better of it. So, do you see nostalgia as a form of healing or enchantment?
So nostalgia, I'm not sure John is nostalgic. Askar possibly is. I'm not sure
Hmm.
John is, because when we say nostalgia, it's many things, obviously, but it's harking
Hmm.
back to the past, and
Yes.
not necessarily wanting to go back to the past, but feeling that there is something beautiful about it, etc. In the case of John, I don't think that he thinks of the past as a beautiful place. He thinks of it as a trigger and a starting point in his life, yes. But in his own way, Asghar has also moved away from the past. He's got a job, he's got a wife, he's got kids, etc. And John has been part of that journey. So it's not like he's harking back to something that was and that he'd lost.
Hmm.
He What he wants is to recapture the bond. He doesn't really care where it is, right? He doesn't want to go back to Baansa. Asghar forces him to indirectly, like
Yeah.
by refusing to engage on John's terms anymore. John is forced to go back to his hometown, to pay attention to it, to look at what's happening here, to look at the creative energy there, etc. But I don't think that he is really nostalgic. He is, um, but as he gets older, he certainly does begin to look at his life through the lens of the past. We all do that, right? The older we get, we turn back. You're very young, so perhaps you don't do it yet. But as we get older, we look at who we were 20 years ago, how the people who were with us 20 years ago made us who we are, were the collaboration, the friendships, the supports, the mentoring we got along the way. And then we also think of where we are and where we are headed next. In John's case, he's not actually in a very bad place in life professionally, but where he's headed is not a good place. He can see that creatively he's stagnating. Financially, if he wants to do well, he'll have to constantly compromise himself. And he wants one way out, not necessarily all ways out, but at least one way, one thing in his life to bring him stability and joy, all of that. So he's actually a very clever, clear-sighted kind of guy. He's more sensible than most people are in his situation. Not very romantic in that sense. Asghar is the romantic.
And this is a general question. Your work often features characters in flux, searching for belonging, meaning, and closures. What compels you to explore such transient nature of human essence or human relationships?
Um, well, I think a big part of who I am is also about seeking something. And often these questions of identity and where you belong, these are things that have often troubled me. Partly, I think, because I grew up in very small places from the age of about 5 onwards. And these are places where we didn't really know anyone else. Like, you move somewhere, you usually have some family, a kind of social circle, but uh, as a family, we didn't really. I mean, it was professional and it was okay, you go to school, so you make friends with whoever is there in school. But it was very clear to me, even as a 5-year-old child, it was clear to me that we don't belong here. And at 15, also, it was clear to me that I don't belong here. I can't live here. As a family, we cannot put down roots here. And so, and that continued through college because I went to hostel, and you can't really belong in a hostel, right? You have to leave it after 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. So for me, I think that was really this question of where I belong and how I can belong to this place has always been there. And when you move to a bigger city and you do try to put down roots there, then you also realize the ways in which you can and cannot belong. What are the limits of belonging in a place? So for me, that question has always been there. I address it in nonfiction in my book, Bread, Cement, Cactus, which is more direct reflection on migration, identity, language, things like that. But I suppose because it is still a part of me, this question, it comes out in almost everything I write.
There's a sense of emotional labor that the women in the comeback performs, whether in friendship, partnership, or the creative spaces. Like when Asghar decides that he wants to go back to college and start his drama company, he almost bluntly expects his wife Zubi to not only support him, but also to go out and seek jobs so that she can support him and the family. Now, as much as demanding women to go out and work, constrain her choices, it's similar to not letting her go out to work. Both the sides are actually constraining a woman's choice. So, in that sense, do you see this as reflective of societal expectations that society have to women that they must hold things together in every single space that they cohabit?
I'm not sure if I agree with that view, actually. See, the thing is that it is true that Asghar's choices will obviously impact Zubi's choices, right? If a man loses his job or quits his job, then somebody has to hold things together. And usually the expectation is that his wife will then step up to fulfill the role that he has, for whatever reason he cannot do or will not do. But the way patriarchy operates is more complex. On the one hand, it keeps women from the workforce, even if they do want to work, because for whatever reason, they provide free labor at home, they are easier to control within a confined domestic sphere, etc., etc. On the other hand, it also traps them into an expectation of what they deserve and what they are required to do in this world. Um, this particularly impacts, I think, upper class women. There is this sense that they're there to be taken care of, and first your parents will do it, or whoever your natal family will do it, and then your husband will do it, and it's his job to do it. Like I've actually heard many middle class and upper class women say that, what other job does he have except to take care of me and the kids, right? I think that's also a fairly patriarchal way of looking at the world, right? Or perhaps it's a more just animal way of looking at the world, where roles are circumscribed, where, like any other animal, a man has a job to go out and feed the female of the species, etc., etc. But if that is your worldview, then you also have to really look at nature and see what happens in nature. And in nature, the females of various species also go out and look at their food, except for very brief periods when they're unable to for pregnancy or hatching eggs or whatever it is. And I think that the expectation that a man will provide for you lifelong and for the kids as much and to the extent that you want. It is not just that Zubi expects him to work, it is also that she's not willing to come down in the world as far as class is concerned, right? She's not willing to just live wherever he's living, eat what he's eating, send the kids to a government school, right? So this expectation that she has that he will keep doing what he's always done is also quite patriarchal in its own way. So I think what I'm trying to do here is push back a little bit against that, to kind of make it apparent that that this is also a trap. This, where artistic talent is concerned, the expectation that if you're a man, you have a family to feed. I mean, yeah, but there's also a woman in the picture. She's also educated. What's she doing?
Agree, totally agree. Um, in the comeback, do you think women characters offer a counterpoint to the masculinity-driven struggles of Asghar and John? Or were you consciously writing them as foils to the male characters, or do they stand apart in their own rights?
I don't think I consciously thought about the masculinity of Asaghar or John. John, I did a little bit because sometimes he just really behaves badly. he, he behaves badly with women, particularly because he has trouble, I think. I mean, not in the world of the novel. He doesn't have the self awareness to be able to analyze his own behavior. And I'm telling the story in his voice. So, I can't give him that degree of self reflection. But he is forced into reflecting a little bit, at least, when things are bad for him. And I think the kind of person he's unable to see women in their fullness. He does see Asghar in his fullness. He does see other men for how they are, and he keeps trying to reach out to them. He doesn't want to let go of those bonds because those bonds are valuable, right? In society and personally, they're valuable to him. But the women he does treat in a shabby way, whether it's his wife or whether it's this woman whom he actually does, in his own way, he loves her, but he doesn't treat her very well. She's there to feed his ego when he needs it. So he has to take a really hard knock in life before he's forced to see that, she's not just the object of my affections. She's more than that. Um, and I see this actually in real life too. I see a lot of men, decent men otherwise. I mean, otherwise they're nice people. Sometimes they're talented. Sometimes, you want to be friends with people like that. But they actually only see you as something to acquire or something to test themselves against. And once they have passed the test, you're no longer of any value to them, except when they need something again. So I see this quite a bit, and this is a particular kind of, I suppose, I hesitate to call it toxic masculinity because I mean these days everybody uses the word toxic very loosely. but in its own way, it is toxic. In an emotional relationship, you need to be seen and accepted fully and equally. So yeah, and Zubi, I see Zubi as, I don't really see her as feminine energy of any kind. I don't know what your interpretation was, but for me, she's her own person. She's fully her own person, and she gives back as hard as she gets in every way.
That's feminine for me, giving back as art. So moving forward, many of the women characters seem to navigate their struggles collectively, even if in small ways. The way Shakila ma'am consoles Zubi, the way Zubi takes care of Nazo. Do you see this as a form of resistance against the individualistic, competitive world that John and Asghar inhabit?
It's interesting you say that. I hadn't thought about that actually before, but not while writing it. Um, but I think I see Zubi because so Zubi does look out for Nazo, partly because she understands the pain of this, right? Of having been kind of led up the garden path, so to speak. You wait for a guy and wait for a guy, and then, you know, then uh, he just casts you aside and moves on to a different woman. And so she understands that John has behaved disgracefully in these terms. But at the same time, it is also complicated because someone like Asghar, for example, it would not be appropriate if he is continuing to be friends with John. It would not really be appropriate in the way of the world that it is for him to reach out to Anazo, or, like the way the world is. If there are couples, for example, if there are two couples who are friends, it is very difficult for the man of the couple to develop an independent relationship with the woman of another couple. That relationship is loaded. It's very difficult to write also as a writer, because it would have gone off in a completely different direction if that. And so the bonding by default, because of how society is, needs to be between the women.
With respect to male and female friendship, the novel subtly highlight how women often support each other in very intricate, very small ways, right? Was it an intentional commentary on how gender shapes emotional bond?
I don't think it was an intentional commentary. It may have been unintentional. I wasn't thinking so much of the gender dynamic while I was writing this book. But I do think in general that women do look out for each other in very small ways, sometimes even for strangers. You see that there's a woman out in the streets, and if she asks for help, chances are she'll turn to another woman if she's feeling unsafe, right? So, in these small ways, yes, it is true that you do kind of look out for each other. It's, but by and large, it is also true that women also do not look out for each other in favor of men, because if they did, then patriarchy would not exist. By and large, the patriarchy exists because, not just because of what men do, but because of what women refuse to do, which is abandon the men in favor of the women in their lives.
Then I would want you to discuss a bit about the material means of art. Art in general is considered to be something sacred and soul-wrenching, and usually we shy away from discussing the material means that goes, behind to make the art come live, or the connections or contacts that one ought to have to bring the art to the public, and which the novel brings beautifully out to us. So, was it a conscious decision, or it was inspired by your own involvement with theater and the hardships that theater as an art faces, especially in the current neoliberal times?
Not just theater. I think writing in general, my experience has been it's very, very, very difficult to get people to pay for any art form.
Yeah.
Especially in our kind of country where, that people have very limited disposable income. But even when they do have disposable income, whatever little they have, they tend to spend more on religion and religious festivity than they do on art. And this is true of all across all sectors, I think. Um, so where does then that leave artists? And then the other problem is that we don't have the kind of institutionalized state support systems that a lot of so-called like developed countries, whatever the developed world is, they have invested. And I don't think anyone does anything without a reason, right? If a first world country, if a country that has disposable income, if it is investing heavily in the arts, it does so because it sees value in it, right? There is both economic value, cultural value, and it is soft power of a kind that you set yourself up on the global stage by investing, by sending your artists all over the world, etc. And I think in the beginning, India did take the right steps in this direction. They set up the academies, they set up the fellowships. The thing is, we didn't go far enough. And then in recent times, there's actually been either that space has shrunk, like the institutions themselves have shrunk or receded from whatever, taking a primary forward kind of uh, vision for the future, or what they do give is negligible. For example, if you get a Sahitya Academy fellowship or something, it may be enough to see you through 1 or 2 months. But you look at what the cost of living is for a middle class person in a major metropolitan city today, and you think of how much time it takes to actually produce a work. Uh, take theatre. Mm, it costs lakhs and lakhs of rupees to mount even a medium sized production, right? Um, and everybody has to be paid there, from the lighting assistant to the set maker to the writer to actors, of course. Who's going to pay for all of that? If everybody is just trying to make a go of it, ticket sales, just counting on nothing but that, then you get the kind of art that is easily consumed, right? Then you challenge nothing. Then you don't dare not take risks, because how will you take a risk? Not only do you not have the money to take that risk in terms of, say, set design or something, you also don't have the money to travel with the show. You don't have the money to take a chance that, okay, I'm saying something challenging in society and audiences may or may not accept it. Or I'm breaking the mold in some fashion. That's what art is supposed to do, right? Push the envelope. How will it push the ideological and artistic envelope if you're constantly worried about how many seats you can fill in the theater? That's not how art works. You're supposed to just do what you want to do, and if people like it, they'll come to watch, or they'll talk about it, or something like that. And then this is a problem, see, because then we suffer and our artistic landscape suffers. Despite that, brilliant stuff does happen in India. It happens a lot in Bombay, actually, in Mumbai, because I think partly because the artists themselves are subsidizing theater by working in the commercial space. So they'll maybe go off and make an advertisement, and then they'll go and do a more challenging play when they have the time. But that is artists subsidizing each other. That's not really institutional support, or even like, broader, you can say, commercial sponsorship of any kind. And in the smaller centers, it doesn't happen at all, because there's no work commercially. So then how can there be any work uh, artistically if there's no work commercially? So these are the challenges, and I think that my own experience has been the kind of money that playwrights get, and the kind of money that artists get for, say, for writing a book, or even writing a film script. Actually, it's not enough to the amount of time that you spend on it. You might spend anywhere from 6 months to a year developing a really good script, whether it's for the stage or whether it's for a film or whatever. If it's really good, you do draft upon draft, you seek feedback, you respond, etc. So you should be paid enough actually to sustain yourself, if not for a year, at least for 6 to 8 months, um, until you can move on to the next project. And that doesn't happen. You don't get paid enough to even sustain yourself for 2 weeks. Sometimes not even that. Sometimes I remember once for a play I wrote, I made 700 rupees in royalty for writing a whole play. Uh, and people say nice things about it, but where does that leave me as an artist?
So, do you see in this respect writing as resistance? And in what means?
Well, it is resistance to the extent that when we say resistance, what does it mean? It means we're resisting the dominant forces of society, or it means we're resisting a model of being, that is being thrust upon us, or it means we're resisting dominant narratives, whatever it is. So that it will depend on the kind of art you produce. But if you mean writing itself, the artistic, choosing the artistic life itself as a form of resistance, it is resistance only to the extent that your physical well-being is at stake. Like when you're in a rebellion, your body is at stake, right? You put your body in a dangerous place. And in that extent, you can say that art is a dangerous place to be because your physical well-being is at stake, your health is at stake, your the future of your children is at stake. All of those things can happen. So if you choose that, you are certainly resisting the expectation that that you work and live in ways that simply to replicate the system as it exists, that support a family, bring up children, etc. Um, I'm not sure though that that kind of resistance is actually seen as resistance in our society. It is seen as a kind of failing, that you're failing to do what you wanted to do, not that you're resisting what you're meant to do.
That makes sense. Then, who are the women writers that most influenced you in your writing journey?
Um, I think in a direct way, I think that almost everything that you read does shape you. But I think as a child, I'd read a lot of what are now known as the classics in Western literature. I read a lot of Charles Dickens, for instance, and I think that somewhere that was formative for me, looking back. The kind of things he wrote about, the kind of characters that he wrote about, I think that was formative in a fiction, in the fiction space at least. Later, when I started to study journalism, I started to study a lot more nonfiction. So that was also quite influential for me. I mean, writers who could look at society and describe it and write beautifully, but without any kind of I think nonfiction really one of the things is the reason it is both very powerful and very mm, perhaps perhaps why people also prefer fiction is that it doesn't really leave you anywhere to hide. In fiction, there is that very small thing at the back of your head that it's just a story, even though we all know that it's not just a story, that these things happen and it's not just something someone cooked up. It's all around us. But nonfiction is harder sometimes to deal with because you're being told that this is your word. So for me, Everybody Loves a Good Rot by P. Sainath was quite influential because for the first time I sat back and I was like, oh, this is my country. That the things that your parents try to shelter you from, that these are the realities of the world. And to especially think about class and caste in new ways, that was for me quite powerful. Um, Similarly, the work of Bezwara Wilson, who works on sanitation and all that, for me, that was a big awakening. And many other nonfiction writers, actually, that they have been quite influential for me. In plays, I would say that, of course, we all grew up reading Shakespeare, etc. So that is just part of the syllabus, um, and we all know. I mean, there's not much more to be said about Shakespeare. But I did like reading Bernard Shaw a lot. I enjoyed the humor and the irony of his work. I think I actually liked Shaw better than Shakespeare when I was a child. Later, the appreciation of other aspects of Shakespeare also grew. But I liked Shaw. And later in life, once I started reading Indian playwrights, then I really liked the work of Vijay Tendulkar, for example. He's been uh, in the Indian theatre space, that kind of power in his stories and the way he also, like in some ways you can say comparable to Dickens in that way, because he looks in society as in an unflinching way and writes about things that regular middle class people don't necessarily want to write about. So that was very powerful for me. Also, Girish Karnad, the way he uses myth and the way he was able to dig into our own theatrical traditions and narrative traditions to tell new stories. I like that.
That's a very wholesome list. So, just the last question. What piece of advice would you like to give to budding writers who are navigating through contemporary writing scene?
Firstly, just write. Uh, there's no formula to writing or to building a writing career. If you just look around you, I find it very interesting to actually look at interviews of writers, or listen to podcasts like this, for example, just listening to people tell their stories, how they got to where they got. There's so many paths people take, so many career paths, so many different, like you come from here, you come from there. But if you have a story to tell, you end up telling it anyway. Sometimes you start early, sometimes you come to it late. Um, but the one thing you do have to do in order to write is to do the actual job of writing. That no one else can do for you. No one can, people can support you, say financially or whatever, but they cannot do the writing for you. You cannot, nobody can make you a writer. You become a writer through the writing, and you become a better writer through writing a lot. A lot. Um, I I look back and I think that I wrote a lot over the years. Even as a teenager, I was always writing, whether it was letters or essays or just diary journal entries. So that continues actually as a practice. If I don't have a deadline, or if I'm not, for example, writing poetry for a very long time, I do go for very long periods without writing something that is publishable, or that has form or structure or shape. But writing is also about thinking. It's about a way of stepping away from the world, cutting everybody else off, and it's talking to yourself. So that is what makes you a writer, really. The ability to do that, to reflect, to question, um, to build the associations between ideas in your head, to say, okay, that happened, but that also happened. And then, to allow that to happen, you need to recede from society in some way, in terms of time, and sometimes in terms of, you know, like whatever career expectations there are. So you need to create that space for yourself. You're going to have to earn it mostly. For most of us, there's nobody else bankrolling the project. So you're going to have to earn that little space that you create for yourself. And I would also say, don't be afraid of it. It is hard. I'll be the first person to say that it is very, very hard. It is especially hard to write for a living. So you're going to have to end up juggling 4 or 5 different things, add newer and newer skills to your kitty, because you're not just skills. These days technology is changing so fast. What was relevant 5 years ago is no longer relevant. So you have to adapt. It's going to be hard, and you have to believe that this is good, not just good in the sense of that it will lead to good things for you. It may lead to very bad things for you, actually. But you have to believe that it is good in the sense of it is worth doing for you as a thinker and a person and a citizen, and it's going to be good for the world.
Thank you. I am done with my list of questions. Smita, do you want to ask something?
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very lovely interview. Annie, thank you. If you have a few minutes, I'll want to ask you a couple of questions.
Yeah.
In fact, one of my questions was about writing practice and writing rituals, which I think you just answered. The other thing, Annie, is that, across all your works, um, you have written across genres, right? And you have won like major awards across genres. And it's difficult for publishers and sellers to sort of, they're always looking for ways to silo their writers, is what I've noticed. So, how has that worked out? And how have you worked around with that invisible structure sort of thing? Moving across genres, moving across themes. Every book that you write is very different from the last book.
Um, I think in my case, one of the things is that I wrote for a living. Very few writers do that because it is that hard. And like I said, I always talk about money because people in our society, especially, are not supposed to do that. But the thing is, people come up to me, parents, sometimes students, they'll say that we want to do this. But so the first thing I'll say that please stop any expectations that it will be a career for you. Just writing as a, like writing fiction or writing poetry or whatever. One has to separate the practice from the uh, the more practical aspects of life. That you have to do that anyway, and regardless of, you have to look out for yourself. So for me, I think because I always wanted to write many things, even in college when I started to write. Initially, I didn't like set out to be a writer, but I wanted to write. I was writing poems. I started writing a couple of short stories. Then we started doing theater, so a couple of small skits, etc. The small artistic ambition was always there, but I also knew I'd need a job. So I didn't go about looking for writing jobs. I was willing to take any job. I was willing to study management. I was willing to study hotel management. I was willing to anything really that did not require me to sit and do calculus. But I would have done it. But then one of my teachers pulled me aside and she said, look what you're going to do with your life. And I said, ma'am, I have no idea. And she said that, have you thought about mass communication? Because you're a good writer. So maybe that's a good fit for your skills. And so then I ended up becoming a journalist. And journalism is a career. That writing fiction may or may not translate into income, but journalism did. And that was in some ways very lucky for me because it was only as a journalist that I was shaped as a thinker and as a person who goes out into the world and has experiences and sees what life is like, not just my own small life, but other people's lives. Uh, is forced to question my own role and my own intervention in their lives, etc. So I think I had a lot of material. So as a job, I was learning to write nonfiction because that is my day job. And eventually I grew to like it and I got better at it. So I learned to write essays, I learned to write long form. That led me to writing memoir because I mixed up my own personal story with the larger narratives in my society. But when it comes to, say, plays or when it comes to, I did have to quit my job because poetry you can still, because you write it in short bursts. So you can still say, okay, I wrote it after work, or I went to a meeting or an open mic on the weekend and I shared my poem with others. I could still make space for that with a full time job. With larger projects, novels, and plays, I was finding it a little more difficult, especially because journalism is extremely demanding. Not only demanding in the sense that of the number of hours you put in, it's intellectually very demanding. It's your brain is constantly occupied. You can't disconnect. You can't go home and then suddenly put away everything that you've been doing, seeing, feeling, and then say, okay, now I will write a poem. Or I will write a novel, which requires a whole different investment in structure and time and character development, all of that. So I was finding that very difficult. I took breaks, several breaks, um, in my career. Sometimes I would quit for a month, sometimes I would quit, say, for 6 months and then go back to a job. Sometimes I quit for a whole year. But I wrote my first play when I quit for a whole year. When I finally quit my day job and I was working part time to make some money, I had the time to process the ideas I had. I and a lot of that actually did come out of journalism. I think that everything that I'd been researching, everything I'd been feeling, some part of it was under the surface, but I needed the breathing room, the time, in order to allow these feelings to come up and for me to actually do something with them creatively. So I think that for me, career breaks were crucial. That is fun, I think. Secondly, allowing all kinds of new experiences. And then allowing also to say, it is true, I agree with what you're saying, that publishers often want to put you in a silo, even people, even readers, that they don't know what to think of you as. Just when they started thinking of you as a poet, you've gone off and written a novel. Just when they start to engage with you as a novelist, you're writing plays. So sometimes readers also don't really know what to expect. And I think a lot of readers actually like to know what to expect. And sometimes this can be a disadvantage in career terms. But for me, even though I do write for a living, I did not set out to write because it's a career I wanted. I want to say something and I want to say it in my way, in the form that I am choosing. When I wrote a play, it was because I wanted to write a play, but also because I see the power of theater. I see what it does when I go to watch a play. I see the way it is moving me viscerally, right? Or a film. I see that it's engaging me and my mind and my heart and soul in a completely different way. It is only when I see that, okay, what I'm trying to write belongs in a space of enactment rather than a space of just text, that I start to experiment with a new form. And then the demands of the form also change how you write. So my work is different in different forms. For example, Prelude is such a different kind of novel because I have worked in theater and because I wasn't quite sure what form I wanted to write in. When I first started writing, I thought maybe I will write a play or a short story. And but then I ended up writing a novel. But the fact that I can also write drama, or that I also want to write drama, somehow leads me to different structures, different narrative choices. And and I think this informs everything that you are, everything that you allow yourself to do, ultimately then becomes the work. So the more you allow yourself to do, um, there is more risk in that, in not staying in your lane. But if you take the risk, I think the creative rewards can be quite fulfilling as well.
Yeah, that was very beautifully said, the creative rewards. And, because there's always this tussle between commercial reward and artistic reward. I think those of us who are not able to follow the commercial career path, who have to practice their artistic instinct for the sake of it, I think what you've just shared is going to help us, you know. Um, would you like to share any book that you're reading right now? Are you reading something right now?
Uh, I am reading Nusrat Jaffri's This Land We Call Home, or This Land Called Home. Um, it's quite interesting. And for me, because of my interest, especially in migration and identity, etc., that is one thing. The second thing is that in our society, in India, elsewhere too, I think, but particularly in India, conversion has become such a hot topic in that sense. And it's very strange because we're a country that has always converted. from one thing or the other. Thousands of years we have converted, and converted in major and minor ways. Sometimes converted simply by adopting new practices and leaving old practices. But we've also been very mixed. There are people, we have documents and records of this. There are people who identify as both this and that. Um, and the caste always complicates things for us. But now, for the first time, I think we are legislating conversion, where we are actively setting out to say, no, you can't. Or if you do, then faith, which is such a personal matter, and really it has no space, the state has no business interfering with that, um, is being made into a public project where it's everybody's business, and what your personal belief is. And I think Nusrat's book is quite interesting because it tells the story of one family and their complicated decisions, and how within that one family there is so much, it is a tribe. It is notified first as a criminal tribe, and therefore the impact on them, and then, but also the negotiation with caste about kind of trying to move up in the world, but also just trying to survive in in the climate you find yourself. And what actually it is like then to then negotiate that process of conversion. What is it like? What does it do to the girls in the family? Who marries them? Who manages to find someone who agrees to marry them? And and then if they, whether they marry or not, what kind of lives they lead. I'm halfway through it. I'm finding it very interesting. Through the story of one family, it's like the story of not our times, I would say, but the things that lead us up to this moment, all these different things. It's such a rich, we have such a rich history, and we're constantly suppressing mm, the non-dominant narratives. The dominant narrative might be one thing, but under the surface of that, there is so much complexity and richness. And this is also why it's so important to tell stories, I think, because each story that you tell, the more stories there are, the more the dominant narrative is challenged.
I saw this book on your Instagram grid actually. So thank you for sharing so much about it. And when you said that it's our job to tell stories, I've often joked with my friends that it's not the job of Indians to be in IT companies. It's the job of Indians to tell stories because we have so many stories and so many multiple ways of telling the same story. uh,
Mhm.
and it seems that this book also does that. So I'll be picking it up very soon, and I think we'll try to either review it or run an excerpt in the magazine. And Annie,
Definitely.
before we end this, I will request you to leave a little message for the readers of Usawa.
I think more than a reader for the no, more than a message for the readers of Asaghar, I'd like to read a message for the founders and people who actually do the work in Usawa. I think spaces like Usawa are really precious. I think because just as just as we are art poor in the sense of not having artistic jobs and support, we're also art poor in the sense of not having spaces in which to put out whatever work we do. When I first started writing, there was just like, oh, I have a poem, where do I send it? And the only place at that time that I could think of was the little magazine. And this is way back, 20 years ago. And it took me even 3, 4 years to manage to place one tiny poem there. And there was nowhere else to submit at the time. Places like Indian Literature finally published a couple of my early poems, which was the Sahitya Academy Journal. It still exists. But outside of that, there was nothing. And the dot-com boom came to us early. I mean, we were already there in 99, 2000. So many news websites, but there wasn't much for original work. But that has begun to happen now, and I'm very glad. Usawa is one of them. There are a couple of others. But given a population, I think we need so many more as well. But at the same time, I also know the work involved. I've often thought about, should I also set up a magazine? But then I think of the work involved, and then part of me is daunted because like journalism, it is also work, right? You have to edit, you have to maintain the website, you have to proof things, you have to deal with writers. And this is a labor of love in its own way. So I think that I really both admire and appreciate this labor that goes in. Without it, I don't think we could nurture a new generation of writers. And it is absolutely so critical. Once people start publishing books, or even for established writers, suppose you just want to publish a single poem or a single story, there's nowhere to go. And so that is where Osawa really provides that platform, and it provides a home in a sense. When we say providing a home for a work, it is a home. You need to be out there, and the editors of the magazine have to create that space for you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. The team, I think the first thing I'll do is I'll share this clip with the team. Thank you so much.
Please, and my compliments to the team.